Well, this evening we're going to continue to look at the biblical alternative to dating, and something, of course, which is meant to safeguard our children from making a very bad choice with regard to a spouse. The dating method, as it were, of finding someone in this way is really fraught with many different possible difficulties, not the least of which is that an attachment would be formed outside of the oversight and wisdom and counsel of parents. The problem is once that attachment is formed, it's very difficult to break, and so it shouldn't be allowed to be formed until there is one really who is worthy to form that attachment with. That's what courtship is all about, trying to circumvent that premature affection and trying to direct it in the right path. Now, we've looked at a definition of courtship. I don't think that it's on the board here, but this is what we have thus far. A supervised, non-threatening, non-binding, exclusive, consensual arrangement that allows an eligible young man and young woman and their families the opportunity to explore whether they would be a good match for marriage. I think that's a fairly good definition of what we're after. Again, some of the advantages of courtship we saw helps to preserve purity during a time when our children, our youth, are most vulnerable to losing their purity. There's certainly a great deal of temptation during that time of life. It helps to ensure marriage in the Lord because of the temptation to form attachments with those who are non-Christians in the dating kind of situation. This will help in the respect that there will be more eyes looking, examining to determine whether or not that individual really is a believer. Helps ensure compatibility. Again, when the affections are attached, everything else kind of goes out the window, doesn't it? Because love can cover a multitude of sins, a multitude of difficulties and problems. The person who is in love really can't see clearly any longer. And that's why, again, we don't want that love to form before we understand whether or not they're both eligible and compatible with one another. That's another advantage here. So it helps ensure compatibility, gives added wisdom, and honors the headship of the father by giving him the opportunity, as well as the mother, to decide whether or not they can give their consent to this marriage. Remember, ultimately, a marriage is, you have to have two ingredients. You have to have a young man and a young woman who are eligible, and you have to have parental consent. Those are really the only things that you need to have, but oftentimes the parental consent is entirely bypassed. As we see in the Old Testament, we've already taken a look at this, that a father really has the right to to annul a vow of his daughter on the day that he hears it, which means he has authority over her until he gives her away to the headship of another man. So that's why parental consent is very important. Now, last week we considered how we enter into a courtship. First of all, that the young man and young woman, of course, need to come in contact with one another. And certain environments, and certainly public environments, are the best. Church is, local fellowship would be ideal, or church-related functions. And of course, things like this can also happen in other public situations, such as college. And we saw that even if it doesn't happen in that particular context, that situations can be arranged where young people can meet one another. I told you about the one pastor who sent out a picture of his daughter and a note to the sessions of various churches, looking to see if there might be an eligible young man that they could recommend for this woman. And of course, in order to make that recommendation, we'd have to go through the pastor of that particular church and his session. But it's not necessarily a bad idea. And then a website that someone had recently developed that has several pictures as well as, what would you call it, a sort of a biography or a sketch of individual lives. And in order to find out more about them or to come in contact with them, again, going through the safeguards that they've developed in that website and in that ministry to bring it about. So there are ways other than church, other than church-related functions that are at least local. It can also happen with the internet, of course. It becomes much more expansive, and as churches begin these types of ministries. Let's see. Now, we did see also that if they do become interested in one another, that they should begin to, move in the right direction in order to bring about what we call courtship. They need to seek for parental approval, and that requires a interview. That would be the wise thing to do. And again, why do we do this? Well, it's because of parental authority, because of the father's authority over his daughter. We talked about what kinds of things we might want to pursue, what kinds of things we might want to learn. Again, this is a time of discovery. The young woman's father is going to want to interview the young man. The young man's father, perhaps the young lady. The parents will be interviewing one another because this is the joining of families. And so the importance of eligibility and compatibility. We looked at all the different areas. I think these were the suggestions that were made last week with regard to the interrogation or the interview. First of all, that they have a credible profession of faith, and then we looked at doctrine. Is their doctrine compatible? There are certain things that they may differ on that could make it quite difficult for them if they are to get married. Remembering again that compatibility, you've heard the expression opposites attract, but they don't get along. You can be attracted to someone, you can actually become involved emotionally with someone that you're very incompatible with. You don't have anything in common. You may have one thing in common, that you're both Christians, but you could differ a great deal in many other areas. We talked about the differences of Arminianism and Calvinism, or covenantal view of Scripture versus dispensational, or charismatic versus cessationist. There's a whole myriad of other things that could cause potential difficulties, even issues of headship, whether they're all in agreement on who is the head in the house and what biblical submission is. We talked about relationships, what they think about their submission within the church, family, state, and with regard to employment. That shows the maturity level of the individuals, and certainly their personal maturity and teachability, approachability, submission to rules. The man's ability to provide for his wife. Does he have a job? Is he able to manage his resources well? Is he going to be able to take care of a family? Does he have the leadership qualifications? Is he going to make a good spiritual leader as well as a leader in other areas? What is his education, her education? What's their background? What culture are they from, and how compatible are those? Emotional stability. Some people have, all of us have weaknesses. All of us have difficulties in different areas. The question is, do any of those difficulties create significant problems for the marriage, or can they potentially do that? What is the calling of that individual? Is he called, let's say, I think we gave you one example about a couple that we met in college where he believed he was called into politics. She really liked the open outdoors and so forth, and really the two of them were not going the same direction. If she were to marry him, she would end up in a situation in big city and politics and all these things that really were not in her heart to do. And so she decided that wouldn't be a good match. Ended up marrying a man whose heart was exactly the same as hers, and has been very, very happy. With regard to the gentleman, we're not really sure. We weren't able to stay in touch with him. Are there any health issues? What are the expectations? And perhaps under expectations we could include the size of a family. That's very important. He thinks they ought to have 3 children. She wants 18, or vice versa. That's something that has to do with compatibility. Do they have the same goals and expectations? And I guess we already mentioned cultural differences. Now, that's where we ended last week. And one thing we should say here is that if, let's say, a person, the young man is willing to go through this kind of examination, and it all doesn't have to happen at the same time, but his willingness to go through this also shows that he is serious about this relationship. If he says, forget it, I'm not going to submit to this, well then that would exclude him as a possibility. If he's not willing to open up and show what he is like and be examined and get to know the family and so forth, then really he ought to be excluded. So the fact that he's willing to go through this shows a certain seriousness in pursuing the courtship. And remembering, too, that the main goal of this is to find out whether or not, let's say, this young man is going to be a good match for your daughter, this young lady a good match for your son, and so forth. Are they compatible? Are they a good match for life? Now, by going through this, we're not saying that two people who are incompatible who got married aren't going to survive. I mean, they can work it out. And perhaps for most of us here this evening, the way that we actually went about coming together and so forth was more along the lines of dating than courtship. And perhaps we did discover things afterwards that were differences or weaknesses, and we've worked through those things and we've managed those things. We're bound to do that because we've entered into a covenant that is lifelong. But I think you recognize the advantage of doing something like this, even if you may have done it in another way yourself personally, the advantage of doing this to help your children find the right spouse for them. If the person is really way off, and there are so many differences that there's all these red flags going up with regard to compatibility, it's better to stop. At this point, when we're talking about courtship, we're talking about a non-binding agreement to get to know one another, to see if the potential exists for marriage. Since it's non-binding, you can back out. It's better to find this out ahead of time than to allow yourself to form an emotional attachment that you really can't get over, or it's going to leave scars on your heart for years to come. You really do need to guard your heart, and our children need to guard their hearts against forming attachments with anyone that really is not going to be a good match, is not going to be either eligible or compatible with them. And I'm talking about real incompatibility, not just because there might be a few things. I mean, none of us are perfectly compatible with one another, right? Okay, so let's consider that at this point we've cleared all of this, and as far as we know, there's no difficulties, and so we can proceed with the courtship. So the next question we would ask, and an area that we want to do a little bit of brainstorming on, is what should you do then during the courtship? Because this is the door still, and some of this takes place afterwards, but certain of these things we noted last time, we really do need to answer some of these questions before it ever gets started. But once you've answered the important questions, and I think we attempted to point out the ones that are most essential, then the courtship begins, and some of these things you can learn after the courtship is underway, because again, it's a whole time of discovery, right? So I think what I'll do is I think I want to leave these on the board for right now. Instead of trying to erase it, let me just see if I can rotate the board. And let's think about some of the things we might, some of the things that are essential to a courtship. Okay, what do you do during the courtship? And let's go ahead and make some suggestions. What do you think are some of the things that would be important? Is that your hand up?
Are you talking about some of the parents, what the parents do, or what the young people do? Or?
It would be both.
Well, they're going to have to talk.
Okay, that's right, talk. So there's going to have to be time made, both for for the parents to do their exploration of the youth, and also for the couple to learn about each other. So really we need to provide, I think here, we might say provide opportunity for that exploration, or let's say for, we can just put here conversation maybe. Time to talk, time to explore, time to get to know each other, time to get to know all those things we just were looking at before, and get to know the heart of the other person, what they're really all about, where their priorities are.
But for the young couple, to be supervised, I mean, it's a public or something, I'm not sure where we're going with that.
Okay. And that is another very important thing, the idea of supervision. Okay, so we might say supervision here. And I think the term that I had put on here was accountability. And of course, this is one of the advantages of courtship over dating, is that there is supervision, there is accountability. Has anyone ever heard of a chaperone? What is a chaperone? Kathy?
Someone who is present during a courtship situation, largely to ensure that the young people are not alone in a compromising situation.
That's right. So you have the idea of someone who is accompanying them wherever they go to make sure that their reputations aren't injured as well. You see that perhaps in some of the maybe some of the older movies or movies about older times that you've seen. Let's see, is there a couple of examples? I don't know if you've seen the musical Scrooge, but when Ebenezer Scrooge was he was courting Fezziwig's daughter, and wherever they went, Fezziwig and his wife were there along with them. So if they're in a carriage and they're going down the road, then the parents are right behind them. If they're on a picnic, they're perhaps in this one spot, the parents are over in this spot, or if they're in a boat, there's one boat going down the river, here's another boat going after them, and so forth. The idea of accountability, okay? And I think the important thing is that they are never left entirely alone in a place where there aren't others observing them, so that they would be tempted to immorality. That's the most important thing is that they aren't allowed that opportunity to be tempted. Now, I don't know if that necessarily means there has to be a chaperone wherever they go, but I think it does mean that they need to be accountable for where they are, and they need to be with others, and not just alone by themselves in a place where they might be tempted. Okay, so maintaining accountability for their activities, maintain accountability for their whereabouts at all times. I think everybody sees the advantage of that, except perhaps for our children that seem to be snickering or sneering at the suggestion. But that is very, very important. Now, what else might we want to do in this case? I suppose these are the two main things. A couple of other things, though, that I want to mention, unless there's other things you can think of.
Would there be a time, and maybe this would go on to the first one, but a time where you would, I want to say like a stated meeting where you kind of interview, see how this is going,
Right. What we talked about as we were looking at the material before, as far as what it is needs to be examined, what areas need to be examined with regard to compatibility, is that all of these things that we need to find out don't all need to be found out right away. And so there do need to be those opportunities to continue to examine or to continue to talk about, again, what they're all about, what their convictions are, what their goals are, what their abilities are, what their background is, and all that type of thing. And so between parents, but mainly between the parents and the youth, and also between the young people themselves. They need to have continued time to explore those things. Yes.
Well then, so what happens then, let's say, there's opportunity for conversation and then something comes up that is difficult between the two?
Well, I suppose here would be a good time for counseling and to find out what the difficulty is and if the difficulty can be resolved or it can't be resolved, and whether or not that particular difficulty would exclude them as a possibility. I mean, certainly if it were an eligibility problem, that would exclude them if it couldn't be overcome. And a compatibility issue, it just depends on how severe that particular issue may be. Oh, Jan, yes?
Tend to be provide opportunities for conversation for the father primarily to interact with, let's say, the young man in this case. There's going to need to be a regularly scheduled or a plan and structure, and I don't necessarily mean an interrogation kind of thing, but maybe come over and help me mow the lawn, help me whatever, and through that then conversation develops. But it can't just be haphazard, it has to be, I would say, a plan.
Certainly, yes. Those things can't just be, excuse me, they're not just going to happen on their own. So it would be wise to have a plan. Of course, it depends on how long the courtship is going to go, but it could be once a week, could be once a month, that type of thing. But yes, I think scheduling would be a good idea. With regard to this, I thought it was interesting. In the past, there were interesting ways that they provided this opportunity for the young people actually to converse. I recall one example that sounded rather bizarre, where they would both sit, or I think it might have even been in a situation where there were these two places where they could be, and there was this dividing wall between them. So let's say the man was here, the young man and the young woman was here, and in order to, I guess the parents would be in another room, and they would speak to one another through a tube. I don't know if you've heard that example, but this would be like during the time of around the time of the founding of this nation, that they might do something like that, speak through this tube. And I remember watching this program where it showed what the tube was like, and one would talk through it and the other would listen, put it up to their ear and listen and so forth. I don't think it has to be quite that extreme, but I remember one other example too, where if a young man were to have to spend the night for some reason in the parents' house where the young lady was, that they would sew the young man up in a bag. I don't know if you ever called a bundling bag. That was something that was quite common. And so it was like a burlap sack, and they would sew him up entirely so that he couldn't get out. And they would check the stitching in the morning to make sure that it hadn't been broken, and that if it had, or let's just say that the stitching was the same. So there would be a particular stitching put on there to make sure that they didn't get out of the bag. But that would be only if that young man had to spend the night for some reason in that house. So again, they were taking very seriously the idea they want to keep their young people pure and their reputations untarnished. Kathy?
Just two things come to mind. Sometimes, besides conversation, there's a need to observe the person in a variety of situations, at work or dealing with difficult people as well as those that he wants to impress. Seeing how he is in his own household, with his sisters, with his parents. So situations where you're working together, so those opportunities for conversation. You also need to observe lifestyle and observe relationships as well. And then the other thing, this might be a time of discipleship, either of your own child or even, if there's the suitor, say, is lacking some skills in certain areas, or some teaching in certain areas.
Absolutely. One of the drawbacks, though, of course, of observing them, as long as they know that you're observing, they're not going to be entirely like they would be if you weren't observing. So it would be nice if you could either get some kind of testimony, although people tend to paint the best picture they can for their friends and people who they know, or maybe to observe them unobserved, but I'm not sure if that'd be possible. It'd be kind of like spying on them, but you wouldn't probably be able to do that. But if you could observe them in a variety of circumstances and see how they deal with difficulties, you may not get a clear view of how they deal with it emotionally, because they're going to be putting their best foot forward as long as you're watching. But at least you'd be able to see how they deal with problems. If you see particular problems arise, maybe in their work or in a relationship, or even how they deal with the difference that exists between, let's say, the young man and the young woman. So things can still be learned that would be helpful, yes.
Then, along with that, in one sense, before though are allowed to get into a courtship, that's where you would definitely find out, like Arminianism, Calvinism, and that would be kind of a point there that you would decide not to go down if there was any differences there. And yet, isn't there also the possibility and the possible problem that with trying to disciple the other person, that they'll just kind of want to accommodate? So you kind of have to be really discerning there.
I suppose in a case like that, and the point you raise is also a very real thing, is people often become what they think, let's say, the father might want to see in order to gain his approval for the marriage. I suppose in things like that, the church that he's going to, and perhaps maybe if you learn something about the church, there's no way that you can guarantee 100% that you're going to avoid these difficulties, but perhaps have them put their hand on a Bible before they... No. But just remind them when you're talking with them that when they speak to you, that they are speaking in the presence of God, and he's bearing witness to their words, that they ought to be speaking the truth, and that it's going to go against them, it's going to go hard with them if they're trying to present themselves in a way they're not really, because we really need to know what they are like, what they really believe. And by the way, that brings up another good point that I had mentioned before, and although this is going to be perhaps easier for the woman than it would be for the man, but the idea of guarding your heart. Because the temptation to do what you just suggested is going to come from the idea that I've got to have that person, and I'm willing to lie even to get them. If you guard your heart and both of you go in without your hearts already attached, that would be more easily avoidable if they really are looking for a good match, rather than just trying to pass the test to get to the other side. So actually, the young people here, that's what you need to do, is not allow your heart to become attached to the other person until you know enough about them. It isn't until you're actually looking towards engagement that you should even begin to think about that. And you shouldn't think about that engagement unless there's the compatibility and the eligibility. Let me just read a quote here from J.I. Packer. His book, The Puritan's Quest for Godliness Under Marriage and the Family. This quote is in the book, and I think it really sums up what the young people ought to be doing, what the parents ought to be doing as well with regard to compatibility, and how important it is. This is what he says. The Puritan ethic of marriage was not to look for a partner whom you do love passionately at this moment, but rather for one whom you can love steadily as your best friend for life, and then to proceed with God's help to do just that. I think it summarizes the idea of what happens in dating and in most marriages today. The idea that I see this person, I like the way they look, I fall in love with them, I'm so enraptured with them, I don't see any faults, I don't see any problems, I don't see any potential for problems, because all I see is I love this person and I want to marry this person, so I love them passionately at the moment. But then when you get married and you begin to have to live together, then all the incompatibilities begin to arise, and you see that this isn't as easy as you thought it was going to be. And when you have a situation where two people are too far incompatible, that's often what gives rise to divorce. So we need to make sure that the compatibility is there. Let me just read this again. The Puritan ethic of marriage was to look not for a partner whom you do love passionately at this moment, but rather for one whom you can love steadily as your best friend for life, and then to proceed with God's help to do just that. On another website, I also found this was very good, that the person that you ought to be looking for, the young man for a young lady, the young lady for the young man, is not only a mature Christian, and of course you need to be one as well before you get married, but also a kindred spirit. See, that's another way of putting it. I don't know if any of you have seen Anne of Green Gables, where Anne was looking for that kindred spirit, that person who could be her close friend. She wasn't thinking about, at first, somebody who would be someone to marry, but somebody just to be her friend, and how important that was to her. That should be what you're looking for in a spouse, is a kindred spirit. This is somebody who's going the same direction that I'm going, who has the same goals, the same aspirations. That will cement you together much more strongly than just the way you look to one another. Because remember, too, that appearances are going to diminish with age. You look as good as you're going to look when you get married, right? And then after that, age sets in and you begin to get older and you don't look quite as good and so forth. Your appearance is going to diminish. And if your affection was generated by just merely appearance, then your love is going to diminish with age. And you don't want that to happen. You want to love your spouse more strongly rather than less. And so if you don't love the person, you're not really going to have a very easy time. You have to love the individual and not just their body, if I can put it that way. Jan?
Does that get to the definition of love and what love truly is versus what society and the world have corrupted it to be?
Absolutely. And, well, yes, and certainly what should be the basis of our marriage. The three words in Greek for love, most of our marriages today in the world are based upon what we would translate as eros, which is basically lust. They just want the license to be able to fulfill their desires. It's just purely physical. It's body and so forth. But as Christians, we can love with a greater love. There's certainly the phileo, which is a brotherly love, and then there's what's called agape, which is the selfless. It's an all-consuming love, the highest degree of love. But most marriages today are based on this. That's why the marriages don't last for very long. Great example of that are all the Hollywood stars and all their marriages. Usually a string of spouses in their biography and so forth, because they really like this person, and then they got tired of that person, and because of their popularity they can have this person, and so they divorce this one and take this one. And it's based upon this. It lasts just as long as their physical attraction lasts, and after that it's gone. Now, is physical attraction important? We don't want to marry somebody we can't stand the sight of, right? So they have to be appealing, but there has to be more than that. You have to love the person, and that's the soul of the person, and not just the body of the person. So, again, how do you know whether or not you can love their soul, whether you can love that person, that personality? Well, you have to go through the process of learning what they're about, and during that time you need to guard your heart, because if you fall into this, you may just push ahead through all the warning signs and everything you see as far as lack of compatibility, and end up in a very bad situation. Now, how long should the courtship last? What's that?
How long would it take to know somebody?
Okay. There's really no set time, but the time it takes in order to fulfill everything that the courtship is meant to fulfill, until you determine eligibility and compatibility. Okay, so it may last for a relatively short time, or it may last for a relatively long time, but long enough to answer all the questions long enough to make sure, at least as far as it's humanly possible, that this is a good match. Okay, it's a good match. By the way, I think I did have another note here. I wanted to comment that if, let's say, I remember reading I think it was, I don't remember his name now, William Gouge, on domestical duties. He did mention this, that if let's say, you go through the courtship and you've basically learned everything that you need to learn, all the questions have been asked and all the answers have been given, and let's say that the young lady really believes this is a good match, and perhaps she's right, but yet the father has an objection. One thing that the Puritans brought out is that if the father has an objection, it does have to be a legitimate objection. It can't just be because he decides he doesn't want to give his approval. If that person really is a good match, if he is, if we can put it in human terms, praiseworthy and eligible and so forth, then he needs to have a good reason for withholding his consent. And also the other thing that was brought out is perhaps the father or the parents think it's a good match, but the young people don't, and they don't want to get married. Of course, you don't force a marriage like that. Even in those situations where perhaps a person might, during the time of arranged marriages, or a king might want to give his daughter away and so forth, there still needs to be the consent of the youth. So the consent of the youth and the consent of the parents, and the eligibility and the compatibility, which really summarizes everything we've seen. There can't be a forcing, and if there is a withdrawal of consent on the part of the parent, there has to be a legitimate reason for it. They can't just do it because they don't like the way the guy looks or something like that. It has to be something tangible. Does that make sense? Okay. Are there any questions at this point? Yes, Denise. Oh, agape. Well, we usually define phileo as brotherly love, and which phileo or agape? Yeah, that's one way. It's just typically just translated in the Scripture as love. But how would we say this? I suppose it would be more along the lines of unconditional love, or it's the highest, strongest, most self-sacrificing kind of love, although you certainly have that at this level too. Sometimes this word is used of Christ. Most often this is used, and certainly the kind of love the Father has for the Son and the kind of love the Father has for us is expressed in agape. That's about the best I can do at this point. Any other questions or comments? I'm thinking we're just about at the time we wanted to stop the study. So rather than just continuing to pour information, unless there's any other questions or comments, let's go ahead and shift from here and go to the prayer meeting. But before we do, let's just have a closing word of prayer.